Okay, good. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to tear apart the solution kind of in reverse. We're going to start with the report and kind of work our way towards the visual side. So first, let's open up this Crystal report. I'm going to open up my Crystal report software here, and I'm going to browse out to this file. There we go. You can store your Crystal report files wherever you like. Logicity does not care where you store them at, so just if you're wondering why I'm browsing out to my visual folder here, they really don't have to be in that folder. And this, aside from having some fancy stuff going on in here, is just a regular Crystal report. If we go into Database Expert here, you're going to see that we've got an ODBC data source called Visual, and we've simply linked in all these tables into here. We've got a lot of the data linked in for lots of different types of fields you might want to drop onto the canvas. But if we are missing a table, you can just as easily add it in here and link it in, and this report will work just fine still. We've also got a parameter field called ID here, which is just a regular static parameter. And in our select expert, we said set the ID equal to the ID field, custom order ID field equal to that parameter. So at this point, I can run this report. And what you're going to see is this is just, so the real takeaway here is there's nothing special about this report. This is just like every other report you've got written out on your network right now. The next piece going forward is the RRD, or Logicity solution file. Those are actually synonymous with each other, and we kind of use them interchangeably, so kind of get used to that. RRD is the file extension for a Logicity solution file. So, and those, we have them stored wherever you like as well. What I typically recommend for people who are installing this is to have these solution files out on a shared network location somewhere, like if you got a V drive or something like that, just put them in there. And that way everybody shares the same solution files. But if you prefer to break it up a little bit differently, where different sets of users have different solution files, that's fine too. I happen to actually have mine all stored on the C drive here, which would typically not be how you'd want to do it, but just for ease of setup here. And by default, I've got all of my solution files named in a manner where the solution file name matches the module name. So if I go to help about for the screen, you'll see this is VMORD ent for custom order entry. I've got a solution file for VMORD ent. That's not critical though. We really don't care what the file name is. That's just out of the box how we do it to make it a little bit easier to keep track of. So we can right click on this and go to edit, and it opens it in that Logicity solution builder software we talked about. The way this thing works, and like I said, we have two presentations for Logicity. The Logicity Pro presentation we normally do, we go into a lot more details about more things you can do with this program. We're going to concentrate on the visual side of things right now. So you're going to see buttons in here that I'm not going to describe, but if you ever have the inclination you want to sit in on the other demo, you'll get very well acquainted with those as well. The couple I'm going to point out is we've got these are toggle buttons up here. So we've got one toggled for encrypt. That means it's going to encrypt this solution file, which simply means if you took this and opened this file in like Notepad, it's just going to look like garbage. The reason why that's important is we actually store the username and password in this file, and you may not want your end users to have that. We've also got this thing called Workspace Mode, and again, it's just a toggle button. And what Workspace Mode means is whenever I execute this RRD file, is it going to automatically fire off the report that I have in here, or reports, or is it going to pop up the dialog and ask me to select which report I want to run? So in Visual, almost all these are going to be Workspace Mode because you want it to pop up and be a window like this instead of just firing the report off. Next, we've got this area down here, and the terminology that we use for each report in here is an action. So if you're taking a report and you're viewing it, that is an action. So we had it viewing the custom order acknowledgement. That is one action in here. So I can go on this and hit edit, and we'll actually edit the details of this action. The display name, this is what it shows up as in the Logicity workspace for that module. File name, this is where you browse that to the RPT file. Again, this is why it's not important where you store the RPT, because you can browse to it wherever you've got it. We've got database information, so this is what user this report should log in as when it runs. That way we don't bug the end user with it. If you omitted this, they would have to type it in, or if you've got your database credentials set up in a way that they don't prompt, then you would just set it to none anyway. But if you want to, when you normally run a report, it normally asks you. This is the way you can get around that. Next, we've got parameters. So by default, when you come into this, the parameters will be set to prompt user, meaning that it's going to ask you when you run this report any parameters you have. So we had an ID parameter, and that's where we typed in the custom order ID, and then it returned the results. But this particular area is where we can specify one of those parameter values. So we click specify here. It reads the crystal report and determines what all parameters are in there. So remember, we had one parameter called ID, and we would define this. So we'd click on it and hit add. And at this point, you can either just type in an ID if it's always hard-coded. So for example, if you had where it was always running for a single division or a single class of parts and it wasn't dynamic, you can just type that data in here. In this situation, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we want the customer order ID for the one you're currently looking at. So to do that, what you do is you right-click on this field, you go to Insert Variable, and then we break down by the types of variables we have, and one of which is visual manufacturing. And at this point, it breaks it down by the menu structure like you have in Visual. So like we've got sales, custom order entry, and then which field you're linking in. So we'd be interested in the R order ID field. And you'll see it puts this little bit of text in there. You could just type this in if you would have known it. But it's anytime you've got a percent before and after that, we know that that's a variable, and we handle that in a little bit later when we show you the macro side of things. And then for action, like I said, each report we're telling it, what we want to do with it. On the action drop down here, we've got 4 different types of potential actions. We've got view, email, print, or save. So we're just viewing this report, and then you've got the ability to control all these different options for what the viewer window looks like. Things like what the default zoom level is, whether you hide or show certain buttons, whatever you prefer there. And then lastly, we've got logging here. What logging does is really behind the scenes. You notice whenever we ran this, it didn't bug me at all about this. If you turn logging on in the background, it writes to a log file which report was run by which user from which computer at what time, all these different details to a file. And you can have all these things logged to a common log file or to individual log files or any combination of that. If this file doesn't exist already, it'll create it. If it already exists, it'll just append to it. So that's everything we had in the solution file. It's basically a single action to view that report where we filled in the credentials and a parameter. That's the solution file. And the last piece of this is the macro, and this is the piece that ties it all together. So if you noticed when we ran Logicity, it ran off the macro menu here. So if we actually edit this macro menu, you can actually see what's going on behind the scenes here. You don't need to know anything about this necessarily. If you don't feel comfortable working with macros or you haven't yet been exposed to them, just know that you drop these files or the VMS extension into whatever location your users run macro files from, and this will show up in the menu. And all we do is we basically say, we run an exe, where's Logicity desktop at, what RRD file do we run, and all those different variables we had in there, what data from the screen we pass into them. So you don't really need to know that. You could just drop these macros into place and it would just work.